Justin Hawkins rides again. Again. Good day to you. It is I, Justin Hawkins. This is Justin Hawkins Rides Again, my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, sign up for the alerts. Today, I'm going to be regarding some interviews where people are talking about the pitfalls of the music trade. I suppose they're mostly cautionary tales, really, about the legality and just the culture of this sleazy business that we all aspire to exist in, with people's contrasting experiences of it, and I'll react to what I see and give something of my own perspective. Anyway, let's get straight into it with an interview with, what's his name? Oh, Billy Corgan.
The music business plays this Jedi mind trick on you, where the whole thing's set up to be rapacious and take advantage of your weakness. If you get success and you have leverage, they'll get out of your way because you're making them a lot of money.
Yeah, I think that thing about falling out with a record company, he's probably talking about the music industry at large, really, but I did have a conversation with somebody at Sony once when we were sort of negotiating our first, trying to find a label partner for our first record. And there were a few sort of major labels interested at that time. And somebody from Sony said to me, we're going to get along just fine as long as you're selling records, but when you don't, we'll have a fallout. And that's before we'd signed anything. That was completely straight up and actually, remarkably honest of him. We didn't sign to them because of that thing that he said, but actually, it's the same with anything. So I think it's the same. It's the same deal. It's a business. It's the music business. Remember?
The minute you're not making them as much money, then they step in and they start playing these Jedi mind tricks on you.
That's true as well. I think when you're creating something that's easy to market, or the complete product, and nobody can really deny that it's the right thing. Like, for example, our debut album was ready to go when we started looking at label partners. So we had all the power, really. There was no need for anybody to A&R it, which is short for artist and repertoire. An A&R man is somebody who helps shape a band's sound and image and overall sort of everything, really, from every point of the workflow. They try and streamline it into something that they can market so that everybody makes money. But there was no need for, when you're actually on fire and you're creating amazing stuff, you don't need that kind of input. And if you're selling lots of records without that kind of input, it's an easy win for those guys, and they love it. I think when sales drop off, which invariably happens, everybody has it for a minute and they lose it. But when that happens, that's when there's an obligation or a perceived obligation from the people in the music trade to step in and try and assess what's going wrong and shape things into something that they understand, really, and they can do something with, I suppose.
They do these 360 deals where it's like,
right,
if you get a perfume deal, like your whole world,
they own you.
We own a piece of your whole world.
Yeah, the 360 deal is a relatively new phenomenon. I think it started about 10 years ago, probably. I think the first big one that I was aware of was Madonna. I think she signed a 360 deal, which meant that her publishing, her merchandising, her touring earnings, and her record sales, everything basically was all under one contract, which must have been an unbelievably vast, an epic tome of a long form contract. It must have been, I don't know, a rainforest worth of paper to lay all that stuff out, really. But I think the 360 deal is handy if you're a huge established artist, but huge established artists don't necessarily want to give away sections of their business, and I think medium-sized artists, it makes even less sense, because it might be that a recording contract makes no money, but the touring side of it might actually just be keeping the businesses in the black, really. So I don't know, if you're an enormous artist where these different aspects of your business aren't, you know, cannibalizing each other, it makes perfect sense. But for anyone underneath that, and it's a dangerous area, because you stand to make nothing from all of your efforts if it's being cannibalized in that way. And you need focused people in every aspect of it. You need like a really dedicated and hard-working promotions team to get a record on the, you know, heard by people in the first place. And you don't want them. I don't know why. I mean, that's the other thing. Why would you give away areas of your business to a company that has no experience in that world? You know, they're going to be using publishing partners and merchandising partners and people who are experienced and know how to make that stuff, you know.
One thing that did happen during the 60s was,
I love this Frank Zappa interview. It's amazing.
Some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released.
And he's talking about how the old guard, the old boys network, were more inclined to take a chance on things that they didn't quite understand and didn't know how to market, because it was a new market. You know, nobody knew what was going to work, so they just tried everything, and a lot of really interesting stuff came out of that period of time. I think Frank Zappa's saying that when you put young, hip people in, all they understand is like modern pop music, and that's a fairly limiting remit, isn't it? And I think I call it the spell check generation. It's like half these people haven't heard of the stuff that the bands that they sign are actually directly ripping off, and some of it's only about 20 years old. It's pretty disgusting. I think you sort of have an obligation to listen to as much music as possible if you're going to work in this field. And if you don't, then go and do something else.
Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right.
It's amazing. This is an old interview, but I still think it's true today.
We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives. And he's saying, well, we can't take a chance on this because it's just simply, that's not what the kids really want, and I know.
You know, I've been in situations where you go to a writing session for an artist that's trying to break through in the pop world, and they literally want to sound like what's at #1 in that moment. There's no room for progress if you behave like that. It's a complete waste of time, actually.
And the day you get rid of that attitude and get back to, who knows, take a chance.
Well, I think that's a wider point about life in general. People who are so certain of everything, you know, everything's black and white, right and wrong. There's no room for a grey area or opinion. There's no room for discovery, no room for personal growth or anything. It's a dangerous way to live. And music's supposed to be creative, isn't it? It's supposed to be magic. It's supposed to come from the ether or your heart or whatever. It's supposed to just be, it is magic. It's a miracle. Music should be miraculous. It shouldn't be formulaic.
Take a chance, you know, that entrepreneurial spirit where even if you don't like or understand what the record is that's coming in the door, the person who is in the executive chair may not be the final arbiter of taste of the entire population.
That's true. I think he's talking about something like, there's gatekeepers, isn't there, in the music trade? And you think about, you know, all of the bands that you know, like everybody knows somebody who's a talented musician. And every city has a music scene. And you're always sort of wondering, why is it some bands break through and end up getting a record contract and other bands don't? And it's because there's such a small number of people whose tastes determine the activity of their businesses. You know, obviously that's just the nature of it, and it's pretty normal, standard, and what you would expect. But they said that the internet would change that, didn't they? They said it would stop the long tail where the gatekeepers allow a few through, and then there's millions of bands that don't have any kind of exposure or any way to monetize their existence. They said, well, the internet will mean that these bands people will have exposure to these bands, and the line won't be, you know, two bands there making all the money and then millions of others. It would be more flat like that. It would be fairer. But that didn't happen. The internet actually made it worse. Now there's two bands that are making all the money, and then nobody else is making anything at all. I mean, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but it has made it worse statistically.
Most people have seen long-form contracts. They're insane, and there's all these little things thrown in.
I love this Chester interview, because he's talking about music law, really. Music law, whenever you see an interview about music law, it's already outdated because it's constantly evolving. Most of the time you're sort of presented with what appears to be a standardized contract, and it has got a lot of sub-points underneath kind of umbrella bullet points. But it's all based on decades of these things being negotiated and thrashed out, and precedent that's been set by disputes. And I've said it before, that these contracts are designed to protect you from failure and from success as well. Because the thing about success is, unless you get your contract right, it means you're not adequately rewarded, and other people are. The people that you're supposed to be negotiating with and working in partnership with can clean up whether you win or not, you know. So it's important to sort of look carefully at these things, and unfortunately that's a huge part of negotiating your way through the music trade. Is a lot of it is the legality of it, and trying to avoid anything that's litigious is part of it, but another part of it altogether is just making sure that the agreements that you have with your partners, whether it's label partners, merchandisers, whatever, it has to be you have to really go into the minutiae of it to avoid getting fucked. I mean, royally fucked. And I think the most important people in the music trade at this point are probably the lawyers. Yeah, it's the first. I think the first thing you have to do is find a great manager. The second thing you have to do is find a great lawyer, and actually your manager should help you with that, really.
There's a worse one. They used to have damage fees with digital downloads. Digital downloads, like at first they were doing that, like they just trying to get away with murder, you know, just like, let's leave it in there, let's see if the lawyer sees it, kind of thing.
Yeah, you do see that when, you know, but I just think it's natural for lawyers to chance their arm with leaving sort of archaic and outdated and almost universally rejected points in contracts just to see if they can get away with it, really. It's just a starting point for a negotiation. Then you obviously say, well, I don't want to pay damages if somebody digitally downloads my intellectual copyright and you have the right to exploit it, but it's more difficult because everybody's already got it because of piracy. That's not the artist's fault, is it? That means that the sort of safeguards that the person who's responsible for the licenses and are the sort of sacred custodians of it for a period of time, they really ought to meet those costs themselves. But that sort of thing will go in a contract, and it will be considered a negotiating point in your favour. It's like, oh, well, you won that thing about not having to pay the damages if we fuck up, you know. It's just a game. And yes, it's okay to hate the players.
For younger bands that don't have the draw that we do.
I never realised how sweet and soft-spoken David Draymond is. What you get isn't what you see.
Every band needs to really pay attention to what their record contract says. They look at what their royalty rate is. If you realize you're getting 0.07 cents for every stream, and your contract only says that you get 15 points on the record after you've recouped.
There's a lot of zeros after that decimal.
Exactly.
There's another interesting thing about royalty rates as well. I mean, depending on which territory you're in when you negotiate it, your international, like for example, a band might do a record contract in the UK. They have a royalty rate for the UK territory, but their royalty rate for America will be different, and every other sort of territory in between. But the problem is, if you have like a really favourable royalty rate in America, does that then inspire the promotions team in America to push your product? Or is it a good idea to have a lesser royalty rate so that they make more on every record that you sell? I think there was a scandal a few years ago with something called double scanning. And now this is when a bunch of stock from a record distribution place, like it would be distribution place, like it would be, say, a record store. They have a bunch of stock from, let's just, for example, Jossie's Records. We've got 5 artists on Jossie's Records, ranging from one that makes $1 per record and one that makes 1 cent per record. Now, another person altogether called Jussie, who's the executive of Jossie's Records, might phone up this store and say, hey, do me a favour, when you log the sale of this stock, can you make sure that the band that only has 0.1 cent or 1 cent per record is seen as the one that sold the most stock. And so in cahoots with the labels, some stores and some distributors were double scanning the artists at a lesser royalty rate. So they seemed to be more successful than the ones that made more. Did people go to prison for interfering with the careers and livelihoods of these artists who had actually sold more records? No. It's the equivalent of being sort of struck off from the medical register. They weren't allowed to, you know, I think there was some totemistic career changes, but ultimately they all came back, which shows you how sleazy it is. I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to, for example, audit a record company. I think it's difficult to, a lot of the processes that you would normally have in other types of businesses where you can actually check whether you've been ripped off or not. I don't think those are possible. The music trade is traditionally, it's exploiting the you know, the intellectual copyrights that have been licensed to them by people who create music. And in some cases, the archaic ones, they might actually own the intellectual copyright at that point. So then they really do have the artist over a barrel. But I think that kind of contract is more or less gone now. I think eventually you get your songs back. You just allow them to exploit it for a while. Exploitation, of course, being a really suggestive word, but that is the legal term for it. It means that they can make money off it, basically.
I wasn't really taking large advances from the recording companies. I was recording the albums myself in my own studio. So the way I looked at it, I owned the work because I paid for it. And I did all the work. I created it, so I felt like it should belong to me. That said, the companies felt otherwise, and they would always hold this contract up and say, well, you signed it. And I say, well, I understand that. It's not like I want to leave. I just want to, you know, talk about this thing and see if we can't make it more fair. Of course, they wouldn't change, because if they changed, they wouldn't really exist. It shouldn't be a situation where they own the album or the work. We're talking about intellectual copyright. If they're going to be indeed a delivery service, then that's fine. But even FedEx doesn't say that they own the thing that they ship. Large advances.
This Prince one's really interesting because this is when I think this is talking about that time when he wrote Slave on his cheek and was really upset because he signed a long-term record deal, but he wasn't allowed to submit the albums that he'd completed to fulfill his obligations, because they told him that we don't know if in 2 years' time, when the next natural album cycle occurs, we don't know if this album is something that we're going to be able to market. It's a fucking Prince record. It's a complete joke. Of course you're going to be able to market it. It's going to be awesome, and it doesn't matter that it was recorded 2 years prior to when you put it out. People are going to love it because he's amazing, timeless, a real legend. So they forced him to sort of observe a much longer term under contract to them when they basically owned everything that he was putting out. And that shouldn't be like that. As he points out, FedEx don't own the parcels that they deliver. But I think probably partly because of Prince's efforts, that isn't the case anymore. Those kinds of deals are completely gone. Prince has saved us all from that turmoil. And nowadays, the record company will license a recording for a term, or until a certain amount of money has been made off it, or whatever the thing is. But by and large, if you record your own material and you're giving them something that's the complete article, that's yours. They can only borrow it, as it were. They license it. And hopefully, if they know what they're doing, they make you plenty of money, and we all live happily ever after. Keep dreaming, guys. Justin Hawkins writes again. Like, subscribe, sign up for the alerts, and watch one of these 2 videos. Cheers.